Hello, and welcome again to our consideration of the upcoming scripture selections for this week, the 15th Sunday of the year. And the readings come first from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 30, verses 10 through 14, from the letter attributed to Paul to the Colossians, chapter 1, verses 15 through 20, and from the gospel tradition of Luke, chapter 10, verses 25 through 37. Well, this week we will be looking at perhaps one of the most famous of all of the parables in the New Testament, a parable attributed, in this case, only to Luke, and one that almost everyone, even if you know nothing about the New Testament or the Bible, have at least heard of the Good Samaritan. So we'll look a little bit at this parable account. Now, the story that Luke is telling continues from last week. You remember when he had sent the disciples out in pairs to proclaim the good news to places where he himself was coming. The disciples had returned from that mission. Jesus had cautioned them that what they were doing was not to be attributed to them, although the power they received was from the Holy Spirit, and therefore the work that they successfully have achieved was that of certainly the Spirit of God. Holy Spirit, of course, plays a very significant role throughout the Gospel of Luke. He also encourages them to continue this work. Now, in the verses that concluded last time, and between those that begin this time, are a couple of verses which we will not hear on Sunday reading or this weekend reading, which picture Jesus as thanking God, giving praise to God. These would be what we're looking at are verses 21 through 24. And again, I remind you that what we are looking at in these discussions is how the Gospel of Luke carries out the message that he is presenting. It isn't necessarily all of the material that we consider on Sunday or weekend celebrations, but for our sake of our kind of study here, it might be good to notice the continuity. So in verses 21 through 22, and the verses that are left out, by the way, are 21 through 24. So in 21 through 22, Jesus utters a word of praise to God. In verses 23, he addresses his disciples specifically and says to them, "Blessed are the eyes that see the things that you see, but have not seen them." And because he said, many prophets and kings longed for the things that you see and that you hear, but have not heard them, and that those would be found in verse 24. So Jesus, you can see, connects this to the fact that they have come back from their missionary efforts, that they have been somewhat successful, and Jesus thanks God, but also reminds the disciples of the privilege that they have. Now, as we continue, as verse 25 of chapter 10 opens, it pictures Jesus being, and this would be the opening section of the gospel, being questioned by a lawyer of the law regarding what Jesus considered to be the most important commandment. Now, lawyers, and we've mentioned this before, would not be lawyers like we understand them today in the juridical reasons, but were experts of the Mosaic law. And so, unfortunately, the way this is interpreted, has to be seen that the lawyer raises this question with Jesus, and Luke says, to test him. So this idea of testing Jesus, one remembers back that the event that had happened when Jesus had been baptized and had been gone out into the wilderness for 40 days. and had been tested by Satan. In that case, when it had been ended, it said that he had triumphed over Satan, but would come back to test him again. So kind of keeping that theme, you now get, we're not calling the lawyer Satan, but we are saying that this idea of testing Jesus continues in little ways throughout the gospel. What the test seems to be, as the question posed to Jesus is, what do you consider to be the greatest commandment, is to see just to what degree Jesus stays loyal to the tradition of Israel. Because he says, what must I do in order to inherit eternal life? Now, Jesus, cleverly here, asks a question back to the person posing the question. Now, that's a traditional rabbinic style, okay? That sometimes, rather than directly answering the question that is addressed to them, one of the ways, and of course it's an interesting technique, isn't it? Rather than answering the question yourself, you kind of give the questioner a question, therefore directing attention away from yourself and back to him. And that's exactly what Jesus does to the lawyer. And, well, and when I say lawyer here, I think it's important to keep in mind that he is really a teacher. And the title that he uses when he addresses Jesus here is teacher. And it is true that as we now watch what happens as Jesus journeys along the road to Jerusalem, is addressed as a teacher. And the response that the questioner gives is, well, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus says, well, that's the right answer. See, now, by the way, this phrase, love God, love your neighbor, is known in the Jewish community, and even today is often used, is called the Shamar prayer, or Shemar prayer. It in Jewish life is recited twice daily, usually at sunup and sundown. It's something like a morning prayer and an evening prayer, which Christian communities also developed later on as time went on. Very simple. In fact, it would be something that, so the story goes, if one were to wake someone up in the middle of the night, those would be the first things that that person would say. Love the Lord your God, etc. And therefore, the heart, love God with all one's heart. We have spoken of this before. Remember that the heart in the Old Testament, or in the ancient world, was considered to be the center, not simply of feeling and emotion, but also was to be the center of intelligence and of reflection. So, indeed, he gives the right answer. Now, in a certain way, some interpreters of this say, well, what the questioner was trying to do was to shame Jesus, to see if it could put him in a bad light, to see if his answer would be different than the tradition. And as we just suggested, that did not turn out to be the case. So in a certain way, Jesus, now this might not be so nice to put it this way, but has put the questioner in his place. He has asked a question, although it does remind one sometimes of what is advised to real lawyers: never ask a question that you don't know the answer to. Well, in that sense, both Jesus and the questioner knew the answer. In putting the questioner, now, well, love God, love your neighbor, then do that, opens the window to the questioner having maybe to find some way to save face. And so it's at this point that he says to Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Now, the usual answer to that question would be, and certainly it was found in other works of the Old Testament or even in the Pentateuch itself, was that a neighbor was any fellow citizen of the Judaic family, of a fellow Hebrew, okay? So they did know that neighbor extended beyond simply the family unit to those with whom they lived and in villages or towns in which they associated. So the question, in some ways, again, is a little bit of a trap question. Is Jesus going to suggest something different than what traditional Jews did? And we know that this was the traditional understanding. As you know, the famous Dead Sea Scrolls discovered down at a place called Qumran had a series of writings, and in those works, the following was also said, that you should love all the children of the light and hate all the children of darkness. So, who would be considered to be children of darkness might in that sense be part of the question that is being asked. The response is now, as I suggested at the beginning, one of the most famous and well-known of parables, often called the Good Samaritan, although perhaps another title for this might be the Surprising Samaritan. And we'll see in a minute why that title also would fit, although good is the one that is more popularly and regularly known. Now, this has been a parable of Jesus that has been interpreted in many different ways throughout the years, throughout the centuries. And it has tended to be, and I'll start with this, although this is not what we would be suggesting anymore today, has often been allegorized, that is, given hidden explanations about hidden meanings. Now, who does not know the story of the Good Samaritan? That a man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, fell among robbers, was laying on the side of the road, injured, bleeding. Along came two representatives of the Jewish experience, a priest and a Levite, passed by. A third person, Samaritan, sees the man, helps him, assists him, takes him to an inn, and serves as a helper to this man in need. Do we not know that story? Well, the allegorizing of it went something like this, just to show you how you don't need to know the original meaning, but can do a lot of other things with it, but once you kind of set your mind to it. So how does it go? Well, the man leaving Jerusalem was Adam. Why? Because he had been expelled from Eden. Who were the robbers? Were Satan and his minions. When they stripped him of his clothes, what was that? Stripping Adam of his immortality. Who were the priests and the Levites? They were those who failed to keep the law and the prophets. Who was the Samaritan? None other than Jesus. What was the oil and the wine that he used? Baptism and Eucharist, or the Old Testament and the New Testament. What was the inn? The church. Who was the innkeeper? Paul. Who was, what were the coins? The sacraments. So all of that is to say, you can see how you can take every aspect of this story and allegorize it. Wrong. Now, we did that, and you can do that, but that's not really what the story of the parable is all about. You will remember that good parables, and we will see a number of these as we move along over the weeks now, a good parable is a story that is generally drawn from some knowledge that people have, that the audience to whom you tell this parable were familiar with the situation. There are certain ordinary things that happen in the course of telling this story. There tends to be at times a bit of an exaggeration. Then there's a surprising element in the story that you did not expect, that was not the normal way in which this particular story played out, and that good parables generally ended not by giving an answer, but rather by raising a question. So again, those are some general characteristics of a parable. So let's look at this one. A man goes down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Now, the Jericho Road, and it still exists today, was certainly a well-known road, and it was characterized, certainly at this point, as a road in which danger often was very much present. Banditry was known to occur here. The road, now depending on how you measured the miles, but generally it would be a road going down as it did around almost a mountain base, was 23 miles. And it went from Jerusalem, which was at an elevation of 2,700 feet, down to Jericho, which was 770 feet below sea level. So you went from above sea level to below sea level. Jericho, of course, is the lowest city on the planet, even then, and it is still now. So obviously it's very warm there. Maybe warm sometimes would be putting it mildly. It can be very hot there in much of the year. It was a place, and this again is a little background as to the importance of this road. It was a place where those who lived up in Jerusalem, particularly the well-off, now that might have included the priestly caste, but others, would leave Jerusalem and go down to Jericho in the wintertime, where it was warmer. Obviously, they had, in fact, a winter home. Doesn't that sound a little bit familiar to northerners in our own clime, okay? Where do many go in the winter here in this western New York area? But, well, you know, okay? But certainly warmer areas. So interestingly, this was happening even in the first century world. And therefore, those who went on this road, dangerous as it might be, would be those who might be traveling for various reasons to their dwelling down in the Jericho area. Also, it was a road that traders, and merchants would use. Obviously, bringing goods from Jerusalem, and items for trade that were very important would be like oil and wheat of some kind. And so in order to do this, now I give all of this because one will notice something that happens as the story unfolds. In order to bring those kind of goods, like bales of oil or barrels of oil, you would need animals. And so a donkey or other animals to carry that would also be expected. So there's the kind of little background about the importance of the Jericho Road, but as I mentioned, was traditionally known as the Bloody Road because banditry. Now, some have romanticized this a little bit by saying, well, the bandits who attacked these rich people remind one of the later stories of Robin Hood, robbing the rich in order to pay for the poor. Perhaps sounds good, but that most likely was not what was happening. So, what happens? This, whoever this man is, now we presume that he would be a Jew, falls among robbers and is left somewhere on the side of the road, alive, but not quite sure just what his state of life might be. As is pictured, and again, keep in mind that good stories often have three, okay? Number one, number two, and number three. You always pay attention to number three. You know how those jokes work or those stories go. So Luke is, I mentioned this a number of times, a wonderful storyteller. So here it is. Two go down, a priest and a Levite. Now, it is probably true that the priest would be a more substantially well-off person. Not necessarily, but often they were. And so they had a privileged status in Palestinian Judaism of the time. And because what? Of their role of cultic worship up in Jerusalem. So what we might guess is that the priests, seeing this man on the side of the road, crosses over to the other side and bypasses him. And this is followed by a man who is a Levite. We know very little about the Levite, although they probably assisted the priests in cult of worship up in Jerusalem. Whether these two had any connection at all is unclear. What is important is you have one man, two man, you're getting it set up, if you think about it, for the third. Both of them cross to the other side of the road and avoid any contact with the man. Now, all kinds of reasons for why the two men bypass the man on the side of the road. And this, some argue, again, we're kind of exploring in our little discussions here possible ways of interpreting this story, was that if the priest or the Levite came in contact with a dying man, they were rendered impure. And impurity meant that they therefore would not be able to carry out the services that they were expected to do up in Jerusalem. And if, for some reason, when they went over, and again, these are those who kind of look at this story in that regard, if they went over and found that the dying man, while they were even with him, died, then truly they were put in a terrible situation, because they would be expected to take care of burying the man. After all, that is part of Jewish tradition and a custom. And so the argument is, well, they didn't want to put themselves in that position, and so they left. But the main argument would be, or they didn't do it, I mean, they didn't leave, they never went and put themselves in that position. The main argument would be they wanted to avoid impurity, because if they did become impure ritually, they could not carry out their services until they had been purified, and that was a ritual that they had to go through. Now, one author, in looking at this story, if that's true, that they did not want to be rendered impure so that they could continue their work up in the temple in the city of Jerusalem, points out that the priest and Levite were going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, not from Jericho up to Jerusalem. So if they were going down to Jericho, they were not really going to be engaged anytime soon in cultic worship. Well, again, those are all kinds of explanations as to why they bypassed the man on the side of the road. The simple reason what would be is you had number one bypass, number two bypass. Now pay attention to number three. Number three, whom you would expect to be, and this would be how the good story would unfold, would have been a fellow Hebrew. He may well have decided to help the man who is injured. Instead, and here's the surprising element, turns out to be not a fellow Hebrew, although there was some connection there, but turns out to be a Samaritan. Now you remember that this whole episode had begun in chapter 10 with the Samaritans not wanting Jesus to visit their village. There had been this tension. And so now you have this Samaritan who stops to help the man on the side of the road. Now, keep in mind, and the reason why the Samaritan, number one, is a layman. He's not engaged in any cult of worship. Why does he do it? Interestingly, the phrase that is used in the parable, moved with compassion. Now, why would he have, for example, he binds up his wounds with olive oil? Well, as I mentioned, olive oil was an important product in Palestine. It was used, you remember, for cooking, for lamp fuel, for curative purposes. So he kind of helps the man out. He has wine. Well, that was an important item to be sold. And he binds up his wounds and puts him on his animal. As I mentioned earlier, he would need that to carry the goods that he had. Brings him to an inn. Now, when you think of inn, do not think of Holiday Inns or something like that. They were notoriously dreadful places, okay? In fact, the advice given by some writers of the time was that if one stopped a night at a wayside inn, one was best to get out of there as well rather than sick. So anyway, he brings him to an inn, and now makes an interesting, promises that he will return, and if indeed any bill is run up by the victim who had been hurt, he will repay it. So you also get the idea that although he's going down to Jericho, he will be returning. And what a wonderful act of kindness and charity is being shown by this stranger, in that sense, to the Jews. So all of that is really part of the famous parable. Well, to bring it quickly to the conclusion that we will hear, Jesus then says, having told this story or this parable, then says to the questioner, remember again, this lawyer, who do you think was neighbor to the one in need? And he kind of puts does he not, puts the questioner on the spot. Well, he's not going to say, and certainly they would never say Samaritan, but he says, well, the one who was in need. And Jesus says, well, this is the mercy that we should be showing, and go and do likewise. So it ends actually with not the question is posed, but then the author gives an answer, pictures Jesus as saying. Where does the emphasis go in this particular parable? Well, often it goes on the kindness and generosity of the Samaritan. But some say maybe we need to look at the victim. Who is the victim here? Now, we don't know very much about the victim. We assume that it is a Hebrew, along with all the rest, that the Samaritan turns out to be the exception here. The victim must be open to accepting the kindness on the part of the Samaritan in helping him. What is the response of the victim? And some suggest that maybe when we consider this particular tale or story, there might be a place where we should put some emphasis, where in fact we have not. Because what if the victim should die while he's in the inn? Now here, modern people would love this one. If he died while he was in the inn and the relatives of the victim found out about this, whom would they blame for this having happened, if not the Samaritan who had brought him there? Does that sound somewhat familiar as the way things work today? So there's a lot of angles to this famous parable that might be considered. Yes, one could consider that it was the idea of the importance of purity, that was one thing. But maybe the model, again, having looked at the victim, is the example of the Samaritan who takes risks, because it was a pretty risky and foolish action that he did to help this man who was not of the tradition that he belonged, who might be subject to all kinds of criticism. And in the end, the Samaritan, in that sense, does exactly what God promises, to show mercy and compassion to those in need. And so in the end, this parable is an invitation to all to consider that the mercy of God is extended to us, but that through us and because of us and with us is to be given to others. So on this occasion, once again, as we consider the surprising Samaritan, who yes is good, but surprises us by what he does, maybe that's an invitation of what we could be doing once again with and for one another. Thank you for being with us. Hope to see you again.